G'day everyone, welcome to the shed. Today I'm working on the Dodge Brothers car that I've been restoring for my friends Daryl and Suzanne. Now this car came to me quite some time ago and very dilapidated, very run down, and naturally it's nearly 100 years old, so it's been a derelict car for a long time. But this is one of the ones that was made into a utility back in the Depression, Second World War era. So all the back of the body was missing. So I've made a replacement tub section, and those of you that have been following the channel will be already aware of this. This car is a little bit unusual in Australia in the fact that it has a fully imported American body on it. Most of the cars here had locally built bodies because the government of the day had deemed that cars sold in Australia, for every 4 sold, 3 of them had to have a locally built body to encourage our local automotive industry, which worked really well at the time. So this is the 1 in 4 that slips through, and they're pretty rare. Like, I've been around vintage cars now for over 40 years, and I think this is about the 3rd one I've seen, or 2nd one I've seen, that is a fully imported touring car body. So I had to make all this. We didn't have any of that. We didn't have any of the top structure. And from the time I got the car here, I've been scouring the internet for parts, missing things I'm needing and things like that. And this came up on eBay. There was part of a top frame and it was pretty run down. And now I'm restoring that. So I've made these tapered tubes, which is what I'm going to share with you today because they're quite interesting in how I've gone about making it. The original one's quite complicated. I've changed the design a little bit to simplify making a reproduction part, but at the end of the day it will look like the original and function like the original. So we want the roof to actually fold down and work as it did originally, but I'll show you what I started with and I'll show you where we're going with it. Come over here. So we've got all these pieces. So this is roughly a side. So this is the left-hand side of the car. So if the back of the car's here, this will fold out and forward and the windscreen will be about there. Now at the back of it we have got this new tube we're making goes on there, and that fits onto that piece, and then we've got a rusted away piece which is here. This is the part that goes down to the car. So that pivot fits there, and this is the piece that attaches on the side of the car at the back. So what we might do is just go and fold the one that's on the car, and that'll explain it a little bit better. Okay, so I've got this sitting on the car, and I've just nipped all of these bolts up. This one here, that's actually the proper nut on the end there, that's just a little chrome nut. So on this particular car, a spanner would be required to nip that up when the roof was folded and loosen it off to drop it down. Originally it has rivets up here, which I will put back into it when I put the top together for the final time. But for now I've just put some bolts in there and I've just nipped them to make it stiff so it doesn't want to collapse on me. But to fold it, you would release it from the windscreen. And what we'll do is we'll just get that out of there without dropping it on the car and taking a heap of paint off. And then from that point, you can fold the roof, and this has all got to go together. And then that will drop down and it sits into this clamp on the back of the car here. So that goes in there, and then the top latches down, all folded up and nice and neat, ready to go. So that's just how it works. It's quite simple, but I've seen a lot of these cars of this era where the tops don't fold anymore, just mainly because these mechanisms are just so frail and people have welded them or clamped them into the open position just to hold the fabric roof up. So given that we are doing a full-on restoration on this car, it was absolutely a must that the roof function how it was supposed to. So this is one of the timber bows. This is an original one, and because it's been out of a car for probably decades, it has gone to straighten itself back out, which apparently steam bent timber will do that if it's just left alone to its own natural devices. So we will be bending some timber for this roof. I don't know how to do that at the moment, but I'm sure I'll learn. I've learned a lot about these tops in the last few weeks. Each one of these hoops is either a unique width, depending on the car, or a unique radius in the corner, because as it folds down, they've all got to fit together and the fabric from the top's got to fit around them to allow it to fold up. So fortunately for us, there's a gentleman in Bunbury, which is not far from here, with the same era Dodge. So the other week I went over there and I made some templates from his top and Sure enough, each one of these radiuses is different for where the positions are in the roof as it works. So we've got those to copy off, so we'll make our timber match his car, and then that should all go into our frame and work properly. So let's make our tube, and then we've got one more piece done for the final result. So here's the other side frame, and I've already replaced one piece, and I was a little bit fortunate that between the two sides I had most of the intact pieces, even though they were rotten. So this piece of tube here was this piece off here on this side here. So that's a new one I've made, and I had a good pattern for that from the other side. So this one looks okay, but really it's quite flimsy and frail. It's very rotten in the end. There's actually a wooden hoop which pokes right inside these and runs across the car and back into the other side one, and that's for the fabric to sit on for the roof. So we've got to make the wooden hoops and we've got to put them in there, but we've got to have good steel to put them in. Now these are quite complicated. There's an inner and an outer section, and the outer section has got a lap joint on it, and that's what this seam is down here. So that's actually got one edge with a hook on it one way, and the other edge has got a hook the other way, and then it's crimped together to form this lap joint. Now I decided that with the equipment that I own, it was impossible for me to duplicate that. So what I've done is I've created the same looking thing, but on one edge I've just put a safe edge on it and folded it around, and it just tucks back on itself. And on the other side I've just put a little step so it sits in underneath it. And what I'll do to hold it together is put a series of welds in it like I've done here, and in a few spots I've hidden the weld where a rivet's going to go through it. So that'll work fine, that won't be able to be seen. But on these other ones I'll put a nice big heavy MIG weld in there that's going to burn right through to the bottom layer, a bit like a plug weld, and then I'm going to grind it back to match this seam along here, so it'll become invisible once we get the piece finished and on the car. The original forged ends, I've salvaged those out of there, and as per factory I have brazed it back into the tube. So that one's done, but the further complication is there's actually a liner inside. There's another tube pushed inside for the entire length to stiffen it. So I wasn't sure how to go about that, but I came up with a plan that worked, and in the end I wound up making a duplicate of the outside, a little bit smaller down, without the lip on the edge of it, and then I made it so it was tight. And then as I drove it the last few inches into the tube, the tapering shape in there, it locked it all together. So we've achieved that, and we've got all that so it works. I've also started making another one here to replace this section, because I've put the hose clamp on the end there to actually tie it all together, because it's just so rotten to give me an accurate dimension for the size. But this piece here is actually rusted away all down the length in there. So if we put the top together with this on the car, fold it up and down a few times, I'm sure we'd have pieces failing and fatiguing and things like that. So let's make another one of these tubes, and I'll just show you how to go about it. This is the material for making a tube out of. So this is the bigger piece is going to be the outside piece, and this will be the inside piece that'll fit inside it. So the first job is to just fold a safe edge along there, which is pretty easy. I'll just put in the pan brake and fold the edge up, and then I'll crimp that edge over, and then we'll put it through the bead roller and run a step on the other side, and then we're ready to start rolling it up. Because I'm only folding up 1/8 of an inch, this top clamp has got to be very tight, otherwise it will just skate the piece of metal underneath the clamp and it won't fold. So, if we adjust him down. Had that backed off for the radius bender, but we'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to clamp this to the edge of the bench so that I can just drive that edge over, and I want that just more or less in line with the edge. And we want that pulled down pretty tight because it's got to close up to a pretty tight tolerance. That noise is just the piece of metal scraping on the fence. So that's put a good little step in there, which will be more than deep enough for that safe edge to sit into once we roll it. So there we go. So that's bent it up, and what's going to happen is we're going to curl this edge around and curl this edge around, and then they'll sit together. Now you might have thought that I got very scientific trying to work out these dimensions and all made about 50 test patterns. I didn't. All I did was got one of the old tubes and sat a ruler next to it and rotated the tube underneath it and looked at the number where it ended at the other side and made it that wide. Now this tube is the one at the back of the car. So that taper is about there. But what I'll use is this broken off one, and the dimensions aren't quite right, but by sitting this in the middle I get an idea of where I've got to curl it around from. So I just want to get a bit of a line on there, a bit of a line on there, and the same on the other end. Now this is a little bit hit and miss, and each one of these I have made has come out of this process a little bit different, but they have all corrected themselves in the process of completing the piece. So I'm not really worried about whether I'm a little bit offset or anything like that at this stage, because it will roll out. So I'm going to use a radius die in my handbrake, which is this one here, but I'm not actually going to set it and use the apron to actually do the fold. I'm just going to do it with a block of wood and a hammer. All I'm actually going to be using the handbrake for is just a bit of a clamp to hold my piece of metal so I can roll it around with a block of wood and a hammer. Now, the safe edge side we can't hurt. We can put that under there, we can clamp as much pressure as we like on it, and it won't do any damage to it. But this outside edge here, where it's got that little step in it, that's going to be pretty easy to distort and destroy. So we'll poke that in there and we'll put the block of wood along, but we'll be pushing on this edge just back in here where it's folded for strength, and then we're going to roll it up around this piece of round bar. Now I'm just going to pick on the line I put on there. So that is the outside edge of our tube once it's rolled up. So we want to sight down and we'll have that roughly underneath here. Like I say, if it's a little bit out, it's not going to matter because we'll correct that with the hammer later on. This process I didn't actually come up with in one hit. It was a case of I had a rough idea, I cut a piece of metal to the tapered shape, and originally it was only going to be a test run, but it's wound up good enough, it's on the car. The ideas evolved as I went along. I've used different formers on a couple of them trying to improve the process, and this is what's worked to be the best in the end. But it was one of those ideas that until I started actually trying to make it, I didn't have a full idea in my head about how I was going to do it. I'm just working it a little bit at a time, so I'm not going to stretch the edge of the metal too much. And I'm working back on the flat of the metal rather than on the folded edge. Now because this has got to roll all the way around to make a tube, I can't actually bend it too far at this stage, but that's probably nearly far enough. But what I'll do now is this edge is a little bit wavy along the top, so I'll just get the block of wood and the hammer just correct it a bit. Not trying to make it perfect, but we'll get rid of the big ocean views anyway. Now we're going to drag the bottom edge out. Now once again, that other line we put on it is the outside edge. So we want to tuck that in underneath our piece of tube so that when it rolls, it will wrap around there. And like I say, this is the piece that has worked out a little bit differently with every one of them. Now naturally, this end in is a bit tighter than this end out here because it's tapered. Very underrated piece of sheet metal equipment, the old block of wood. Now, this is just a piece of pine. It's soft, it'll absorb a bit of the impact from the hammer. You can see where I'm mashing it up a bit there. But it does protect your metal. You don't wind up with big tool marks and things in there. So I like wooden hammers, I like wooden blocks. Now we have the basics of our piece of metal. So it tapers from one end to the other. So that's the hard bit done. All we've got to do now is just tuck these two edges together and we've got a piece of metal. This is a piece of 7/8 round bar and I've been putting it between two vices. Now this one's not even bolted to the bench. It just floats to wherever I want it, but it's enough to stabilise the far end of the piece of round bar. The first one I made, I had this end flapping around in the breeze, but I've said this before with sheet metal, you need it to take the impact. If it's going to bounce, you can keep hitting it and hitting it and hitting it and nothing's going to happen with it. So by stabilising the other end of the piece of round bar, I was able to get control of it and work the piece of metal, and it worked really well. So we'll just get this set up. Put that on there. So from here I can start working this edge just with the hammer and I can turn it into the radius shape that it wants to be. Now, having bent the odd piece of metal in my time into the unusual shapes that I do, to me this seems really hit and miss. It seems like a really crude and primitive way of doing something, but it actually works. That's what I love about it. It's simple and now we can stay in control. If we look along the piece of metal, we've got a bit of a dip in it here. High spot just there, but we can just work from one end to the other and pull that back into a straight line just with the hammer on the piece of round bar. So we'll go the other side. Now I'm hitting it right on this back corner rather than trying to hit it out there on the folded piece. So they're coming around and heading in the right direction. So we've got a flat on the outside, which we need to have, and we will wind up with a flat on the inside as well. But I need a little bit more curl in here, which I can do easily. And we'll go back and tidy this one up. Alright, now we'll start bringing the tricky bit in. But what I'll do is I might just change that radius there a little bit. When I built the first one, with it all wanting to bounce up and down a bit in the vise, I came up with an idea, which I'll show you in a minute, that works a treat. And I've improved it with each one I've made. So. Like I'm always saying about staying in control, getting your piece of metal to do what you want it to do, I've actually got this edge is a little bit small on this side and this edge is a little bit big through here, so it's going to put my seam a little bit off centre. So I might just rearrange that, but that's all doable. By working the other side. And then coming back to over here. Alright, here's where the little bench comes in handy. This is something I learned just yesterday when I was playing with all this, is just what you can do with a hammer on a bench. So by hitting it there, I can get it to pull in. By hitting it on an angle here, I can get the edge to roll. And between moving it around, I can actually correct where I'm a little bit out of step there, just with the hammer on the bench. So we've got that pulled in a fair way now. Still not really happy with that end, but I can play with that a bit as we go along. So I'll go back to what I was talking about before, about this little trick that I learned and taught myself. Humble radiator hose clamp here. This is a little heater hose clamp, but it just stops the piece of metal from springing back, and it means that when we hit it, it'll work. But it's destroying the clamps. So this is heading for the fifth one we've made, and I think I've killed 3 clamps already. So it's adding to the cost of making this part, making it a little bit horrendous and hexy. No, these are pretty cheap. So what we're going to do, because of the taper, I was trying to work out how I could clamp it, and then I came up with this idea. And it seems to work quite well. What about there? So that's pulling those edges together already. We haven't even got them all on there. And I'm just roughly spacing them along the length of it. And what I'll do is I'll pull a bit of tension on it and then work the edges, and then I'll tighten the clamps up a bit and go back to hammering it a bit. So it's a little bit of working it in as you go, and it does turn out quite reasonable. Like I say, as a sheet metal shaper, you like to use precision to get a consistent result. Well, this seems to fly in the face of that because we're sort of not getting accurate measurements off it. We've sort of done a couple of curly bends that don't quite line up, and then we're just using a hammer and a bench and a piece of round bar to actually make it work. So it's one of those sort of things that you think, huh? How's this actually going to work? So that's the edge I want to roll around a bit more, so I'm holding it just proud of the piece of the round bar, and already that's heading for being centred up on this face in here. So I can tighten that clamp a little bit. We do get the little step sitting on the other edge, but if we just work that as we go, it will sit underneath it and pull in. Now, the bottom end of this is actually smaller than what this piece of round bar is, so we can only go so far, and then I'll put it onto a different piece of round bar to get the other end to call in. But already we're starting to look like a bit of roof. It just butted together behind the clamp and it's bent it a little bit. Just carefully tap that down. We'll have another go at pulling it in. There we go. So we've got our nice overlap. Pull that top one down. Now we also want this seam to actually sit into it. So what I'm going to do is push it all one way, and then I can work the seam by hammering it down against the edge of the piece of round bar. And that's closing that up and making it a nice straight edge. So what I've got now is this end's pretty much where it's got to be to fit over this piece of bar. So I'll have to take it off this piece and put on a smaller bit of metal. Getting there. So that's our basic tube. I've got a bit more work to do to it. I need to roll the end around a little bit more, but that's just a matter of round bar back in the vise and working to get that seam where I want it in relationship to the oval shape of the end. But not quite Pebble Beach, but a very nice lifelike facsimile of the original. So I'm pretty happy with that, and the ones I've already done have come up really nicely on the car as well. And like I say, when they're finished, liner in there, the wooden bow in the top of it, no one's going to look at this car and say, hang on a minute, that's not the right part, someone's made that, which is what we're aiming for in the restoration game. And the little challenges like this is what drew me to it in the first place, because I like the thinking of ways to do stuff and making unusual parts. And I've got to admit, this one had me stumped for a long while, and like I say, it was when I started bending a piece of metal around that most of it came to me on the fly. A minute ago when you guys were not watching, I put some weld on this, but just prior to that, I fixed this little seam up and got it pretty well centered where I wanted it, and taught myself another little thing. All I did was turn the end back to being circular and then squashed it in the direction I wanted it to get it roughly flat on each side and made that nice oval shape that these bows are. So now what we're going to do is make an inside piece and put it inside it, and then we can braze the end on. I won't worry about showing you brazing the end on, that's pretty basic stuff. But where I've welded it, this one down here will be on the join on the bottom, so it'll just sort of disappear off into the rounded piece of the end piece that goes on there. This one has these brackets on it here, because it's the left hand side, they go that way. And then the second from the back bow will pivot on that point. So this one is the bottom one, comes up, this one comes up to form the piece of the roof. So that's all pretty easy peasy. So I will wind up welding that right through there, and that'll give a good solid point for these plates to be riveted back on anyway. But needless to say, the piece of wood will be inside it anyway, and the other steel liner, so it's going to be very strong. And given that I've used a little bit thicker material than what the originals were, it'll be stronger than what the original one was. Haven't really added a heap of weight to it, so I'm very happy with it. It's going to work. So the liner we're going to shape just the same way as we did this, but we don't have to be super accurate with it, because this will form the liner into the right shape as we start driving it in. So all we're going to do is just curl it around roughly in the right size and tap, 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 and she's done. All right, another U-shaped piece of metal. I've nearly got this where I wanted. I will just work it a little bit more on the steel bench and get it closer to the right dimension. Now, each one of these I've done a little bit differently. The first one I left probably like this, and it took a bit of driving it in, but it did actually do what I expected it to do. It curled into the right shape and made itself very tight inside the outer tube. The second one, I made it a lot smaller, and it dropped in until it went to about here, and then the rest of it drove in quite easily, just with a plate of metal over the top of it and a hammer. The third one, I sort of did the same, got it to that point, and then I'm dropping the assembly down on my steel bench like that, and here's this inner tube disappearing further and further on each go. And I thought to my own self at the time, I thought, this is actually kind of cool, isn't it? It's kind of fun. So I keep bumping it away like that, and then naturally not paying any attention to the bottom, I look down there and it's all belled out and got a bit bumpy around there, and I thought, oh, that was actually cut to length. So that wasn't the best idea, so I went away from that one after that one. So it's one of these learning curve sort of processes. So, but I'm just squeezing it in, And then we'll just tidy it up a little bit on the steel bench and we should be able to poke it inside. Now we've got to get this curl on the bottom end because we want that seam that we've made to fit between these two legs, but we've got to have it rounded around so as it pushes in it will actually curl this in until it butts up to the inside edge of that seam. But we're pretty close. Okay, that's got most of the big lumps and bumps out of it. So we'll see how that looks. Yeah, no, we'll roll it a bit more. Settle. Very specialised piece of equipment. Yeah, I'll just put this in the bench, correct that little bit of a curl up on the end there, but we are down to just about here. So there's not much left to go, but that's packed in there nice and tight. It's not going to come out again, that's for sure. Maybe in 100 years' time someone will be looking at it and saying, how do they do that? We need to make a new one. And there we go. It's got him all the way inside there. Now I'm guessing that the factory would have had some pretty flash equipment for doing this, and but we've made one with pretty basic tools, and it is come up like a really good lifelike facsimile of the original. So all that's left to be done now, like I say, is just braze the pivot on the end of it, and we've got a top bow. Big thank you to everyone out there who's been supporting our channel. It's great, guys. Absolutely loves the support. People who have subscribed, thank you very much. We need that because otherwise YouTube are going to turn us off and say these guys are a bit of a waste of space. And love your comments. So please comment on anything you see here, anything you want to see, just pop us a question. If I don't get back to you straight away, doesn't mean that I'm ignoring you, just means that I'm running around like an idiot and haven't caught up with doing all the comments and questions yet. But I will read all your comments, and at the very least I'll give you a thumbs up and let you know that I've actually seen them and read them. And people who ask questions, I will get back to you and answer your questions as best I can. Some cases we'll make a video about what you're asking about. Thanks guys, I'm Rob Teal. We'll catch you next time.